I'd like to learn more about Trans Pride Initiative and in particular the type of work that y'all are able to do in this space.
Mainly, what we're doing right now is we do have a community center, and we would like for that to be more of a public space that people come and hang out in. Mainly, though, what we do right now is we come in and write letters. Um, so that's basically what we're doing right now. We get some phone calls from people asking about resources in the area. For instance, somebody called me yesterday. They're having some trouble with. Um, it sounded like a poor housing situation that they didn't want to give a lot of details on, and
Mhm.
maybe a little sexual violence. And so we talked to them about what's going on as best we can and give them some direction. This is a trans person who is having issues not only with these things, but also with accessing healthcare
Mm.
and basic support for trans identity. They were a new resident in this area. And so we do things like that. That's mainly just support work. But primarily right now, we're just trying to keep up with the volume of mail that we get in from people in prison.
Yeah, well, walk me through that a little bit. How effective is letter writing, and what does that process look like?
Um, y- I would have to say I think it's fairly effective, but it depends on how you're defining effective. So the
Sure.
process would be um, that first we get letters that come in, we triage them. So we may get 50 letters a week. And the first thing is I will read through the letter and make a decision whether this is a priority or emergency letter, needs an urgent reply, or it goes in our regular backlog. And then we'll also classify the incidents of violence that are mentioned in the letter. So we started many years ago documenting every piece of um, quantifiable violence that we can in the system to keep track of what's being reported to us. So we'll record that in our database and then put it in our backlog. And then the backlog goes into a spreadsheet, and we have some remote volunteers that take letters and write letters. And so that process is basically looking at the letter and figuring out how to respond to the person. We don't consider ourselves a pen pal group. So a lot of times we're not building exactly a personal relationship, and we can't guarantee the same person will respond every time. But we will respond to every letter as long as the person's not being rude or abusive or something. And and mainly what we do is address problems with violence or other issues that people are having. And this could be from um, assaults to sexual violence to just frustrations and dehumanizing actions. And so I think there's two ways that it could be considered effective. One would be that it's effective because people have a space to vent to that's
Mhm.
affirming of their sexual orientation or gender identity. It doesn't matter what your identity is, we're going to affirm that. And they don't often have that inside. They may be alone, and they've finally got somebody that will listen to them. Even if we're not doing anything that specifically helps their situation, they can vent to us. The second thing is that, well, I think kind of proof that that helps is that, as I mentioned earlier, when we first started doing this, there were about 30 to 35 people in the system identified as trans. Now there's over 1,100, somewhere between 11 and 1,200. And so people started having the courage to come out, and we became known, and it became known that there was a support group out there, I think, and that gave more people the courage to come out. There's also groups that are now helping each other. So you've got some people inside who have more access to commissary. They'll share their commissary with other trans persons that
Mm.
are more indigent and can't afford things like toothpaste and stuff. We've got a trans person on one unit that's starting a group called Our Voices to allow trans persons to come together and just talk about their issues and talk about their identity and problems in the prison system. So in that case, it can be indirectly effective because it can be empowering and humanizing in a very dehumanizing system. The other thing is can letter writing be effective in addressing problems and issues? And I think it is probably. We Some of the things that we've done we've consistently hit the administration by saying, if you do not address people by their affirming name and affirming pronouns, that causes suicidal ideation, that causes other problems, that's disrespectful, and it increases the likelihood of violence, it increases the likelihood of sexual violence within the prison system. How you treat people is going to affect their experience of violence, and you're abetting that violence. Well, last year they kind of changed and they started calling people by their pronouns and even their affirming names sometimes now. So I think in a sense that's helped. It's also helped where, for example, the person I mentioned who was in the cell with the person that was abusing them, and we eventually got them out. We've had several people who have said we've saved their lives because we wrote to the right or somebody wrote to the right person. I don't know that it's always us. Sometimes we get credit for things we didn't do, but we're there and we're one of several different avenues toward advocating for a person. And so I think it can be effective. I think also letter writing, it de-invisibilizes.
Yeah, sure.
You start bringing people and their situation out into the light, whereas the prisons are a very opaque systems. And so you want that, this helps bring it into the light, what's happening, and it helps humanize people rather than just shutting them away and warehousing them and ignoring them. We've had people who've said that they have been I guess dropped by pen pals before, and they like writing to us because they know that we'll answer every letter, and that makes them feel much more appreciated and valued and human.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's arguable that how much it helps and how it helps, but I think certainly it does help.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly not the tool that I would like to hand to you, but it doesn't mean that it isn't powerful or that it doesn't have a lot to offer.
And partly we're also doing data collection. So in 2018, we were presented with an opportunity to go. We thought we were going to be presented with an opportunity to go talk to some Texas senators about TDCJ's failure to comply with the PREA standards. And that didn't work out. So instead of going and talking to them, we published a report on how TDCJ does not comply with PREA standards. And that was actually somebody with the National Center for Lesbian Rights, a lobbyist with them, then saw that and wrote to us and said, can you send this to every legislator in Washington, D.C. that deals with the Texas prison system? And he sent us the email list to do that. So we use our data that we collect to then further advocate for more broad issues in addressing this. And we look at it as we're not reformists. We want to be abolitionists. And so we try not to take a reformist stance on doing this, but to look at it as we're throwing sand in the gears of the machine to eventually destroy it. And so...
Yeah, can you just very briefly walk us through that for the audience, the difference between prison reform and prison abolition? I know that's a huge question, but...
It is, but prison reform basically says you can change things to alter the system as it exists now and improve it. And we addressed this a little bit with Simon from Germany. There are some positives for reform, but a lot of people who are on the more abolitionist side will say that no, reform will never do away with prison as harm. And at least the way the prison systems are designed in the US, it's very retributive, meaning punishing. And so abolitionists will say, we kind of have a reputation for saying you need to burn the prisons down. And in a sense, that's true. That's what we're saying. But abolition is more about building up. So it's about building alternative systems to just punishing harm. And so there's another idea that often goes along with abolitionist prison abolition and abolitionist thought, and that's transformative justice. And transformative justice recognizes that the situations that are involved in a person engaging in criminalized behavior are not isolated to that person, but they take place in a large social context. And so, for example, trans persons are more deeply affected or more adversely affected, and more disproportionately, that's what the word I'm trying to
Sure.
think,
Yeah.
disproportionately affected by the prison system, because we're shut out from more standard economy. We have a harder time getting jobs. We have a harder time with education, in the sense that a lot of people experience bullying when they're kids in school, and so they drop out, or they do less in achieving their educational potential. So this pushes people toward a couple of different things. One, you would say greater less self-esteem, which increases risky behavior, which can also influence engaging in street economies.
Mm-hmm.
And that, of course, puts you more in direct interaction with police and the justice system, and then essentially the prison system. So addressing these issues, these root sources, that's part of what transformative justice is. So we need to develop more systems of empowering people to be successful in their lives outside of criminalized behavior. That that is what gets people into prisons in the first place.
Sure.
And I think
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
that whole discussion about what is criminalized behavior and things like that's another big discussion.
Yeah, yeah, no question. I mean, we could absolutely be here for years, and I a certain part of me wishes that we were, or to say it another way, I wish that we were thinking about these things a lot more thoughtfully as a culture, as a society. That we were much less interested in CSI and Law and Order, and we're
Yes.
actually like worried about these people that we are shoving in boxes forever and ever.
Less drama, more reality. Yeah.
Yeah, fair to say. Well, with all that in mind, what are some of the successes that your organization has seen in the last couple of years?
Well, you know, we've had some pretty decent stuff outside of the prison system.
Mm,
So if you don't mind, I'll mention a few of
please, yeah.
those. One is that when we first started, one of the things we did was we were involved in the healthcare industry, and so we started calling UT Southwestern Medical School, and specifically targeting their Center for Breast Care to get them to address that trans persons need breast screenings and chest screenings as well. And at first they completely blew us off. It took a year of phone calls. And then finally a manager called and said, we've been looking at what you've been saying, and we figured out we've missed an entire demographic. When can we talk?
Yeah, shockingly.
Right. Another thing we did was we were trying to get low-income trans persons access to general physical and general wellness care along with hormone therapy, because that's just so rare that you get that combination. And so we worked with Parkland Health, trying to influence them to accept trans persons at their neighborhood clinics that they have, about 28 of them around Dallas, and ran into brick walls everywhere there. And finally, we wound up threatening them and taking some additional actions. Parkland doesn't have it on their website, but they now have 2 trans clinics. And so that was the result of several things, but I'm really proud that we really pushed hard. And I think we started that and got it most of the way through until we were shut out of the process. Basically, they didn't want to deal with us anymore.
I mean, that means you're doing something right. Like, just
Right.
the
If you're
list of
pissing
people
people
you've
off, you're doing it
offended. Yeah,
right.
absolutely.
Another thing we did was DART is Dallas Area Rapid Transit. And
Mhm.
so we have dealt with some issues where trans persons were discriminated against in that. And we didn't have much luck working with DART. It's pretty conservative and really not very good to deal with. But we came up with this idea, and we teamed with another group to look at what's called the master agreement that's national. And in the master agreement, it has a non-discrimination clause, and every public transit entity that accepts federal funds has to include this non-discrimination policy. And so we got gender identity and expression added to that under the passenger rights section. So we actually, with this other group, that's another local Dallas group, got that changed nationally. We've never been able to get any attention to it, so people don't know it's there, but that was
But it's
done.
on the books. I mean, that does count for something. That does matter when we start writing new books and when we actually have to return to what's written down and follow policy,
Mm.
should anybody ever actually force us to.
And then there was something that we tried to get. Most of the advocates in the Dallas area thought that the Dallas jail actually had a trans policy, and we found out that they didn't, through addressing some issues that were there. The sheriff, this is Lupe Valdez, and she tried to lie and say, yeah, we have something. We finally found out, no, they didn't. It was an informal policy, which doesn't count. And so we tried for quite a while to get them to just talk to us, and then they wouldn't do it. And so I wrote the policy, or TPI wrote the policy, and said, okay, you won't talk to us. Here's a policy. And so we researched different policies around the United States and kind of took the best and then added our own things that we thought would be a little bit better. They didn't like that, and they still didn't want to talk to us. So we got the Department of Justice involved, and the Department of Justice forced them to at least talk to us. They threw out our policy and came up with something really crappy. And we just looked at it and we kind of worked with them a little bit, saying, no, you need to change this and this. But apparently their attorneys got it and they said, no, this won't work. And they actually implemented most of what was in the original policy we proposed. And so that's actually now the Dallas Police and Sheriff's Office policy for both field interactions and for the prison housing practices. And so those are some things we've done.
Yeah, what an incredible thing to have your fingerprints on. You know,
I
I know it's far from perfect, but to have had any impact on putting that in place feels invaluable.
Well, and I think there's also, the last thing with prison work, I think, is when we look at what movement building is, that's what Trans Pride was really initially meant to be, is kind of a movement building organization. We wanted to inspire people to get involved and to do different things. And then we would try to build different committees that worked on different areas of social need. We haven't figured out how to do that in the free world, but I think we've done that some in the prison system because we've built up a group of people that are now exchanging information. We trade, when we send letters and kind of fact sheet things in, they share it between themselves. We've actually built a bit of a trans movement inside the Texas prison system.
Beautiful.